It really does mean a lot that we sold out both these shows. It's really, really awesome. First off, St. Vince needs no introduction, obviously. Michael Johnson, my co-writer for the film. And Dave Neelsen, who is the producer and also my father. So.
Okay, let's start with questions. Anyone? Yes, sir.
A lot of discussion has been made about the fact that you were unable to get Brett Favre in an interview in this. Any thoughts on why?
I mean, I don't necessarily blame him at the time because we started filming this and I first contacted him in the week leading up to his last game at Lambeau Field, that climax game. And at the time there was still a lot of kind of emotion surrounding it, and he was still kind of in the middle of it. But this is my first film. I can understand his distrust potentially, but I mean, people may disagree, but we really did try very, very hard to make this fair. I don't think we made any shots at him that were unfair. We never bring up a lot of stuff we could have if we wanted to make it a Favre hit film. Yeah, right. So I really would like to hear eventually what he thinks if he ever does see it, because I would have loved to have had him. So.
Back in the back.
Why did you produce this movie?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, obviously, I'm a huge Packers fan. Have been all my life, and ultimately, it came down to I was feeling a ton of things, as was everyone at the time, very emotional about it, and I didn't really understand why. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, this relationship we have with heroes a lot of times, and our sports icons, and anything, not even just sports, celebrities of any kind. When we don't know them, but we feel so strongly about what they do in their own lives, and feel like it directly affects us. And so a lot of it was a self-interrogation into why should I ever feel justified about feeling this much emotion about something I have no control over. And also just, this is potentially, to my generation at least, the defining Packers story. If you're a Packers fan, one of the top 3 things you probably have to have an answer to is where did you fall down when Favre, on the debate when Favre left? Where were you? Were you a pro-Favre person or an anti-Favre person? And the fact that that's such a defining thing about being a Packers fan nowadays, and the fact that the story wasn't being really told from beginning to end in any form, book, film, anything, it was well, let's just do it. So
yeah, as far as my involvement, I just was fascinated by the fact that 2 years after he threw a pass for the Packers, I still felt like he was the #1 topic of discussion amongst Packers fans, the biggest figure in the organization, and it's a guy that isn't even part of the organization anymore. And I just thought, just kind of seeking to ask the questions, why? Why is this the case? Why do people feel this way? And I think the emotion was undeniable. Anywhere you went, you talk Packers, the subject of Favre would come up, always.
Yes?
As a writer, producer, or director, what did you leave out that you wish would have left in?
I'll let you start with that, Mike.
Well, I think the #1 thing on my list, we really wanted to get into the backstory of Favre's career a little bit more. We kind of, when we laid out the framework for the film, we had a lot more dealing with Favre's early years and his relationship, and we wanted to show how he became such a beloved figure. And it just, unfortunately, you guys would still be sitting here for another couple hours. There was just so much ground to cover. I think that was, in my opinion, the #1 thing that we kind of had to leave out. We just kind of had to start with Favre's here, and he's beloved, and then this is what happened afterwards, as opposed to kind of setting that up. So, that we did plan to do that, but it just would have been too much information. I just don't know how we would have made it work. without making like a 4-hour film.
And a lot of people don't necessarily believe me when I say this, but honestly, during the production of this, we've been working on this for about 2 years, from beginning to end. I honestly was able to put all emotion aside once I was actually like doing the nuts and bolts on the film itself. And just purely from a storytelling perspective, the #1 thing I would have loved to have had was the Randy Moss subplot, because that goes all the way through from beginning to end. And so that's something that we'll probably put online in some way at some point, because it's incredibly compelling. But again, it's a time issue. So.
Sequel.
In the corner.
Sequel.
What is the situation with Brett and the Packer Hall of Fame?
I don't know. I mean, we'll see. We had this question on Wednesday, and we had Lori Nickel and Bill Johnson here for that. Lori's under the impression. Well, so Brett's been out for 1 year. So after 5 years, he's eligible to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So the assumption on Lori's part is that at that time, you'll probably get both around the same time. You'll get the Pro Football and the Packers Hall of Fame, and you probably won't have a whole lot of time after that. She's thinking maybe until he comes back and gets his number retired. Who knows? We never really know. We haven't been able to predict any of this so far. So, but at least 4 more years probably until we have to wait.
Yes, sir.
What percentage of Packer fans do you think are pro Brett at this point, and are any of you?
Well,
Let's start. Yeah, let's start with
Sure.
Pro Brett
Exactly.
versus pro Packers. I think it's probably fairly uniform that, as mentioned in the film, that most Packers fans will always feel indebted for what Brett did for 16 years for the Packers. But the hard part for fans is that we discovered, we're reminded once again that our superhero has very quickly shown that he's human. And like all humans, he too has his flaws. And that he went from such a high, elevated position to such a dislike in Wisconsin. It's almost like the governor.
That's a different film coming out in the fall.
I think if Brett had decided, once he retired from Green Bay in March of '08, if he had decided to go into politics in Wisconsin, he probably would be the governor, and we'd be relieved of all this other nonsense that we're dealing with now too.
Yeah, I think obviously you saw that last picture at the end of the credits. That's he and I. So yeah, we're pro Brett. We've been pro Brett for 20 years. He's a great guy. Think about going through this whole process. You can be pro Brett, but that doesn't mean you loved how he handled this. But you can also be a Packer fan, which most of us are, and we don't necessarily think they handled it all right either. So it's really why it came to a divorce. And I think the fans are the kids, and you kind of get burned in the process, unfortunately.
Do you think the fans will react the same way to Aaron Rodgers as they have to Brett Favre?
I think that's a fascinating question. I think that's something that we asked when we were making the film. First of all, I think they're very different people. I think Aaron Rodgers is very much more guarded about his public life. I mean, I always joke, people knew Favre's family. You knew Bonita and Bima and Big Herb, obviously. And I don't think, at least at this point, that same relationship is there with Aaron Rodgers. But I don't know if fans will learn. My conclusion is that as long as he's playing well and he's winning, people will love him. And what's going to happen down the road, I think the memory of what happened with Favre will be such that I don't think the organization would make the same mistakes that they did. I don't think Aaron Rodgers would necessarily make the same mistakes that Brett Favre did. But in terms of adulation and adoration, if he wins another Super Bowl or two, I know I love him, so I don't think, you win. As an athlete, if you win, people love you, and that's just kind of the nature of the game.
I think, let me just add real quickly to that. I think a fairer comparison, instead of Aaron Rodgers, would be Bart Starr. Here you had somebody who was at the pinnacle of his career, spent his whole entire career in Green Bay, and retired, and to this day, no one says anything negative about Bart Starr. He's as classy a guy as you ever want to meet. He's always been there for the Packer organization. Anytime they want Bart to come up from Alabama where he lives, he's there. You know, and I know he enjoys the adoration, call it that. Why wouldn't you? But that is something that for going over to the Vikings and playing for them for 2 games, 2 opportunities to beat the Packers, Brett cashed all that in. You know, now he's always going to, have a high position as far as fans are concerned, but only to a degree. He'll never achieve what Bart Starr has.
Would have handled the controversy of Brett Favre.
That's fun to think about, isn't it?
You can't use those words here.
As being a sort of a Lombardi fan myself, I think the best way to answer that is if they made a documentary about that, that would have been about 5 minutes long.
I will mention though, if you've ever read the wonderful biography on Lombardi, When Pride Still Mattered, there's a quote in there that we almost put at the beginning of this film, when like really early on. It wouldn't fit now, but Moranis notes in that book that Lombardi's one complaint with the sport of football for all his career was that the quarterback position was too important. And it's just kind of interesting to think about that just a little bit. And we see that even today. If you don't have an elite quarterback, you're not even a contender. And if you do have an elite quarterback, you're kind of, you don't want to keep him happy. So it's kind of interesting to think about that dynamic. It's fun to think about that.
Way in the back, last row.
What do you think the Packers did wrong with handling Brett Favre? What was their biggest mistake?
I think, personally, and we've seen the situation happen with the Indianapolis Colts with Peyton Manning, a lot of people make comparisons, whether that's fair or not. I think once Favre wanted his release, I think that personally now, after being involved in this project and, spending countless hours wasting my time on message boards as this was going on, I think the right thing to do would have been to sit down with them and say, okay, Brett, and be upfront with them and say, we're not going to have you back, we're moving on, but what we will do is we'll sit down, you can give us a list of places that you might be interested in playing. We're not going to trade you a division rival. You have to understand how that would hurt us. But there might be 5, 6, 7 destinations where you might want to go that we'd work out a trade. I don't think, like Tom Pelissero says in the film, the Packers just wanted it to go away. And by doing that, I think it just got worse. I think they should have been more upfront and honest from the very beginning about the fact that they wanted to move on, he just wasn't going to come back, and that was the end of it.
Now, Cliff Crystal, the great sports writer who's covered the Packers since the Lombardi era, had a very interesting point that we weren't able to fit in this film also from a different perspective, saying that he thinks the lesson to learn is that they should basically gutted the Vikings for all they were worth and traded Brett to him immediately. And say, give us your next 3 first-round draft picks for him. And just cripple them that way, and be like, fine, take him, because the way he argues it is, if you're truly confident enough that you don't need Brett Favre, then you shouldn't be worried about your rival taking it. So it's an interesting point. There's a lot of different things they could have done. Overall, I just think it moved really fast, and before anyone could tell, it was wow, out of everyone's control, and it was just how do we resolve it?
Yes, sir.
Just wondering if this came up during your process of investigating this. I know growing up in Green Bay, one of the things that I was talking to my brothers and sisters about was that they had, with Favre's dad dying, that had a big effect on him and his decision-making process. Like after his dad died, his dad kept him in check, and it seems like his ego kind of ran wild, and he got all this stuff where he was hemming and hawing about coming back, retiring, going back and forth. Did that come up at all as far as a theory?
Yeah, it did perspectives on that. Greg Bedard, who now writes for the Boston Globe, but is in the film, used to write for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, believes very much what you were just talking about. That Brett would have handled this very differently potentially. I think Greg says to us that Bigger was all about you are about the team. You're not bigger than the team, and that was kind of like his thing. I wasn't there, so I can't say, but that's what Greg told us. But then Lori Nickel had the opposite perspective, saying she directly asked the Favre family that at one point in her covering them, and said that their reaction was that question's out of line, that, you know, Brett's an adult himself, he can make his own choices. So there's disagreement even between reporters that are colleagues of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel about the question of that, so it's interesting.
Yes, Denver.
What are plans for the film? Is it going to be shown on TV? I know a whole lot of people who couldn't be here. They live in other states.
I would love that. You know, right now we're taking it on to a bunch of film festivals. We have a bunch that we're submitted to, not necessarily know if we're going yet in the fall, and kind of just trying to get distribution at the moment. We want it to be something that everyone can see. Because, you know, at the end of the day, we're not trying to make a penny off of this. This was a passion project. I mean, you know, it was an itch you had to scratch. So I really would like to share this with as many people as possible. But if you just follow us on our website, lastdayalambeau.com, we'll keep updating Fire Film on Twitter. So.
And I'll do a little self-promotion. We would love to get it for Wisconsin Public Television. About that possibility, but to be honest with you, we don't know. It's a 50-50 chance, but also this film is so great that I would love to see it on ESPN as well. So either way, I think it would be great to have a broadcast opportunity.
And so far, you know, there's about 650 of you that's seen this film, you know, that you're showing. So obviously you play a big part in it. If you could talk about it, you could share it, that creates more conversation, which helps the process.
That really is the biggest thing. If distributors can see that there's a market for it, which means people talking about it, then they will talk to us. So.
Question?
I think it was very well done, and what I was thinking about was that how would it relate as far as bringing it out to the national, and a lot of football people would like to see that, you know. And one thing about that also what I would say is that as far as Brett going to the Vikings, the Bears, you never wanted to help them out, so that's why you wouldn't want them to go there. That's why you didn't want Favre to go there, because he was still dangerous. You didn't want him to go to their rivals. And that was the main thing. They didn't want him to go to the main rivals, the Vikings or the Bears.
I would agree with that. I think in terms of blowing it up, the national perspective is, we really tried hard to make this not, you know, Favre is the case study, but the fact that any sports fan, you know, at any age, you probably have a hero that you can relate to. And the question was why, again, why do people feel this way? Why is there this incredible passion over, you know, I mean, how many people in this room have met Brett Favre? I mean, other than, you know, okay, a few, that's good, yeah. You know, but how many people know him? And that's the point, and that's where I think it resonates with a national audience. You watch these people on TV, you know, you cheer them, you curse them, you know, and you really come to feel like they're a part of your life. I mean, with 16 years, he was the quarterback every Sunday. I mean, I was 10 years old, and by the time he threw his last pass, you know, I was an adult, and, you know, I think a lot of people have that feeling with their sports, or, you know, even not necessarily sports, just their heroes and their icons. So from a national perspective, I think that's what we were kind of hoping to, you know, show people, that it's not just Favre, it can really be anybody. And it's really psychology.
Yes, sir.
When Holmgren left, we had a succession of coaches that Brett seemed to kind of rule over. Do you think that played a role in this whole thing? That he got out of control that way?
We did. That's one of the things we left out of the film. We really tried to get into that. I think we had some differing viewpoints from again, these are things that the beat reporters could lend so much insight to. But I think there was a general consent that, especially under Mike Sherman, that Favre was kind of allowed to do whatever he wanted. And so when Mike McCarthy and Ted Thompson came in, it was very hard for him to be told, you're going to be held to our standards. And I think that's where a lot of the disagreement was. But I don't know if I can say that for sure, because I think we did have a couple of different viewpoints where people said actually Mike Sherman was more of a disciplinarian than he was made out to be. And at the time, all those years, Favre was going through a lot of family tragedy. With his father's death, his brother-in-law was killed in an accident. Deanna was battling breast cancer. So it maybe wasn't so much that Sherman just won't let Favre run amok, so much as he was just kind of trying to take it a little easy on the guy because he was going through so much, and maybe that was perceived as letting him do whatever he wanted. But I don't think there's any doubt that McCarthy the relationship was probably never very good from the start. I think that's pretty much the consensus from what we've learned.
Well, and it's interesting because I think both can be right. Like the idea that could totally be like Sherman's motivation. Like his motivation could have been to go easy on the guy, you know, to allow him the extra time to, you know, he knew what he was dealing with, and he is the star player. You know, they do earn the right for some special treatment, but it can have an adverse effect potentially. I mean, you can have both be true in a certain sense. So,
right here in front.
Obviously, I mean, your guys' point that you just said, you know, it gives this whole controversy can happen to anyone. Do you guys think, you know, with players that we still have, like, you know, Donald Driver, for instance, who's kind of been, you know, one of those hometown loves, do you think it comes hand in hand with an ego that someone that believes they're bigger than that? Or do you really believe that there can be someone who grew to love, play with us their most of their career and then retire? I mean, on a side note, do you think he will win Dancing with the Stars?
I don't know about the second one. I've heard he's done pretty well.
he's doing really well, isn't he? Yeah.
That's what I think. I have some experience interacting with professional athletes and interviewing, and there's ego involved. I mean, and I think what fans have a hard time doing sometimes is understanding that this isn't profession for these guys. I mean, you know, yes, it's a different profession. You know, they're not, you know, on an assembly line making widgets. You know, it's a lot different. There's people that love them and root for them, and they get a lot out of that. But I think what you have to realize is that it is their job. So when a time comes where an organization says, we're not sure if we want you anymore, can you really blame the player for saying, okay, but I want to go somewhere else. I feel like I can still play. And Driver had the comments at the end of last season, you know, informed that he might not be back, or he might be back in a, excuse me, a very limited role, and he said, look, if I feel like I can go somewhere else, I can still play, and that's what I'm going to do. And as a professional, I don't think you can blame him for that. Now, how you handle that separation, you know, I don't know if there'll be a Donald Driver documentary, but I don't think you can blame a player necessarily for saying, okay, you don't want me, I want to go somewhere else and play.
Well, I'll be totally honest, I really do think out of all of this whole thing really could have gone a long way, just like objectively speaking, to being not what it became, if Brett simply did something similar to what Al Harris or Aaron Campman did when they just said gesture. They took out full-page ads in all the Wisconsin papers when they left, and they were not happy with the organization either. I mean, Aaron Campman was very upset about the switch to the 3-4, and Al Harris was very upset that he wasn't getting allowed to come back in the middle of the season after rehab on his knee, and so they were upset with the organization. However, they had learned potentially from the Favre thing that you want the fans on your side still. Now, I'm not saying that he has an obligation to do that, because I don't think he does, but he could have saved himself a headache if he had done that. You know, you wouldn't have potentially had the booing the way it was if they had just had a little bit more of a gesture.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Did you get the perspective from any of the players that played with both Favre and Aaron Rodgers, like Donald Driver, for example?
We wanted to. We had William Henderson on at one point to be in the film, and then we couldn't get back in touch with him. You know, whatever. But we ultimately it came down to, if we can't get Brett to speak for himself, it felt kind of odd to have his other players talking about it. Like, it felt like, you know, yes, some players could lend some insight into that other side of that player-fan relationship. But if we suddenly, I mean, you guys just watch this. At some point, we cut away from the main story thrust and go to William Henderson talking about his relationship with fans. It would feel like a tangent. You know, like it would feel like, okay, this is not really related, it's interesting, but we're kind of, you know, not moving here. So, you know, we would like to potentially put something like that in a book about this, potentially, we'll see.
Just as a side note too, we did approach the Packers as well to talk, and they at first they said no, and then they said, well, you know, wait till he retires and then we, you know, call us back, we'd be interested. Well, obviously, that didn't come very quickly, but also they won the Super Bowl. I mean, really, at that point, they really had no reason to talk. But it is interesting that they at least acknowledge that they might have had an interest to talk.
Okay, one last question.
It appears that Mike McCarthy doesn't get enough credit for bringing this thing to a final climax. 2 questions on that. One, did it ever come up with with McCarthy saying you can come back, but we're not going to guarantee you're going to be the starter, you know, which would break Brett's streak, you know, that the other question is, in a 6-hour session, was anybody else involved in it all besides McCarthy and Brett?
Greg Bedard told us that that Ted Thompson did poke his head in it apparently at one point and like totally ruined all of the progress that had been made on this. Those are Greg's words, but I'm just saying, like, you know, apparently like they were like, you know, they were getting beyond things and Ted poked his head in it and it wasn't good. But it was mainly Mike and Brett, and like they said in the film, it was just, you know, Mike needed, I mean, think if you're in that role as Mike McCarthy, how confident do you feel going like, okay, I'll give you the starting job back, but I know you hate my guts, and I know you hate Ted's guts, and I know you resent Aaron Rodgers, and I know you, like, you know, how can you possibly feel good about that? I mean, it's entirely impossible, but I guess I'll let you answer the other question about...
Do you think he promised them the starting job back?
Boy, I have no idea. I mean, I really can't answer that. Personally, I would think no, because I think McCarthy's the kind of guy that once he makes a decision, that's his final decision. It's one of the things I think we learned, and I hope some people that watch the documentary, just specifics about what happened in the situation, because Ted Thompson was really the public face of all this. I mean, he took a lot of heat. And I did find it interesting to really learn that Mike McCarthy was more the one who said, you know, I'm not going to bring him back in the locker room. You know, I think Ted just didn't want to make a decision either way. It was so difficult for him, and I think McCarthy, I get the impression, and this is just my speculation based off what we've heard, I get the impression that the second that NFC title game was over, McCarthy was ready to move on. That's my impression, that he was done. You know, he had his own visions for the future of his team, and he wasn't going to deal with wavering, and he wasn't going to deal with, you know, what, I guess if you want to say bad decisions, even though Favre had such a great season. So I just thought it was interesting that Mike McCarthy was really, I think, the main player in, you know, finally creating the divorce.
Well, one more point on that. If you disagree, if you don't believe that, and you have your right to do so, but watch the full unedited cut of that press conference between the three of them, Ted Thompson, Mike McCarthy, and Mark Murphy. The only guy of the three of them that has any reasons for any of the decision is Mike McCarthy. The other guys are like, it's tough, it's sad, gosh, you know, I didn't want to do this, but we had to do something. Mike McCarthy's like, you know, he had to get on the train, you know, he had actual reasons for what he, so I think that's kind of revealing.
I think that's all we have time for, but one more gigantic hand for this film.
We are going to be moving over to the Hilton for a brief kind of gathering. If we didn't get to your question, come on over, we'll talk some over there. So, if you mind,
the bar.
Yeah, right. The bar.